Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Inspector George, welcome to the committee. Ms. Olson, thank you for being here today. I note in your testimony, Ms. Olson, your comments regarding the culture at the IRS, and I think it is a concern that has grown from a concern to an outrage amongst Americans in the country, and the lack of trust between citizens and their government, and a lot of it stems from the abuse of that trust by the IRS. And I note certainly the ongoing abusive practices related to, or at least the hopefully not ongoing abusive practices related to targets and auditing and harassing of Americans based upon their free speech rights and their engagement in standing up for their beliefs, that they might be targeted by the taxing entity in the United States. I note that in recent years there have been reports of the IRS reading the private emails of Americans without a warrant in violation of their Fourth Amendment rights. And the IRS's response or their position was, Americans do not have an expectation of privacy in their email accounts. Americans do, and they disagree. I note the presence of Congressman Roscom, who's been very outspoken on this issue, that in recent weeks there have been much light shed on the fact that the IRS has been seizing the assets of Americans without due process, without any crime required, without any allegations, without any representation. This is more than a culture. This is an agency that has destroyed the trust between it and the American people. It believes it's above the law. It believes it can ignore the constitutional rights of Americans. And it is just a wonder every day to pick up the newspaper and read about what constitutional rights are being violated by the IRS, whether it's the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment. And it is beyond a culture. It is a broken agency. And maybe it's time to consider wholesale change. Maybe it's time to consider the fair tax. Maybe it's time to consider something completely different, because what's happening at the IRS is not working, and Americans are outraged. And so I look towards the Inspector General and Ms. Olson for your ideas, but I note that there has been many throughout history who have noted that the power to tax is the power to destroy. And that's what's happening in this country today. And Americans are outraged, and I want to know what the Inspector General, Ms. Olson, what you think should be done, and how we correct these abuses of the Americans' freedom and constitutional rights.
Go ahead, please.
All right. Well, I think there's a lot in your statement. I too share the concerns about the civil asset forfeiture, and I think some of the oversight that this Congress is doing on that and looking at the due process protections that may need to be added to that process are very important. I think that in terms of the culture, I make a distinction. I think in each of the instances that you've raised, it's a very small portion of the 90,000 IRS employees who are involved in that. And I think there we really need to look at those actions and see what more we need to be done. I will also note that the IRS adopted, after I'd recommended it for years in June, a Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And one of those rights is the right to privacy, the right to confidentiality, the right to a fair and just tax system. And you know, Mr. Roscom and this House, voted it passed it last summer, and I believe there'll be some action this year. And I've recommended that you actually codify that and hold the commissioner accountable for making sure that those rights are worked and honored in every aspect of tax administration. And frankly, only then will you get back the trust of the American taxpayer.
And I would simply add, sir, I think you were quoting Lord Acton about the power to tax being the power to destroy. There's no question at all that resonates with people. Although I should preface my statement by saying, since President Reagan's administration, sir, the Secretary of the Treasury has issued a directive to discuss tax policy for the Department of the Treasury. It is given sole authority to the Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy. So I need to I need to adhere to that. So, but the bottom line is it has to be fair. People have to know that they're being treated respectfully. And I will note this because, again, I was a staffer on Capitol Hill when the IRS Restructuring and Reform Act was passed, which created TICTA. And I don't know whether, and Ms. Olson's office. So it seems that periodically the IRS experiences this period where things are amiss. And I'm not sure, sir, whether you were here or not, but I earlier, again, gave a lot of credit to the current commissioner, who is an extraordinarily experienced executive and who is taking these matters quite seriously, and I think will hopefully have a positive impact on the workings of the IRS.
Well, I appreciate your response. There's a lot of work to do here, and I think beyond just a Bill of Rights, I think there need to be wholesale changes of how we operate the IRS and maybe looking at complete reform, things like the fair tax.